my family. But anyway, thanks for coming to From Darkness to Light, the story of soldiers in Scripture. This first session is just an introductory thing. We're not going to be reading the Bible as much, but I'm going to kind of give an overview of what my interests are, where I come at the Bible from, and also kind of some things that we'll do and give you some new context for thinking through this stuff. So if anybody's a Bible nerd like me, you might recognize this present darkness. Oh yeah, you got to mute, sorry. This present darkness you may recognize from Ephesians 6, when Paul writes to the Christians in Ephesus, our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the principalities of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And so it's a preamble to Saul's talking about the armor of God, in fact. And we'll get to that in another session. But before we get there, I want to get to know you all, and I'd like you all to get to know me just a little bit, and then we're going to be starting at the beginning. So, who am I? I am Logan M.I., or Logan Martin Isaac. That is my handle on social. I'm mostly on Twitter. I hate Facebook. I think there's probably an account on Instagram, but Twitter is basically it. A little bit about why you might trust me to be giving a Bible study on soldiers in Scripture. I spent my first 2 years in the Army in the 82nd Airborne Division. You see my unit there. I was an artilleryman, an artillery forward observer. In the 82nd, I was mostly a radio telephone operator before I graduated to an E4 with the 25th Infantry Division. And I deployed there as a forward observer in January of 04, came back. Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, that's correct. January of 04 through February 05. Now I got out in a really odd way. I began reading my Bible in the desert and was overcome by this sense of desiring to not be a hypocrite. And I didn't know what it meant to be a Christian. And so I wanted to find out. And as an artilleryman, when you read the Beatitudes and it talks about loving your enemy, that's a bitter, sweet pill to swallow. And so where I settled on the question is I asked for permission to lay down my weapon, be a non-combatant, leave the artillery, but continue in my enlistment contract and eventually deploy. My unit had come under deployment orders. And that my commanders didn't like that, and they essentially showed me the door. And you can read all about that in my book, Reborn on the 4th of July, which is available exclusively at pewhq.com, because I bought all the copies after my publisher came out against anything other than opposite-sex marriage. After that, when I got out of the military, I have to remember to click back on Keynote, I spent 2 years, actually, 3 years at a divinity school at Duke University pursuing a Master of Theological Studies. It's actually a 2-year program, but my first year was difficult, not because I had problems or difficulty with the theology, but because I discovered what it meant to be a veteran in a civilian's world. Professors, the academic training was great, but I was leaned on a lot by professors for advice on dealing with soldiers and veterans and such. And I finally graduated. My emphasis was in ethics, and my thesis was actually in pastoral care. And I didn't go into the military or go into divinity school intending to, but I quickly found it necessary to think about just war, pacifism, and everything in between. Then after that, I started teaching at Methodist University. I found out I had more money in my GI Bill, so I went to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland and got a Master of Letters in Systematic and Historical Theology with Tom Wright and Mark Elliott. You don't see me in my habit tonight, but I may be in the future. I'm also a professed Hospitaller of St. Martin. It is a new ecumenical community in the Episcopal tradition that focuses on prayer, hospitality, and reconciliation for veterans and all those who have been affected by war, poverty, and violence. If you want to learn more, you can go to HOSP Martin, hospstmartin.org. I also did their website because I'm probably the youngest hospitaller. I might be. I think I am. And then finally, I am also the creator and founder of Pew Pew HQ, which is a social enterprise that promotes human dignity for soldiers and veterans by empowering military families to be spiritually mature and politically engaged through education and advocacy. And I won't say much more about that now, but if you want to check that out at pewpewhq.com, you're more than welcome to. And if you come in person, you'll also see, as Diane has, I have all kinds of merch, all of which supports human dignity for soldiers and veterans. So that being said, I'll start with Diane. All right, so now that we know one another a little better, let's see if I can get us to begin. Do I have to click on this? There we go. So does anybody have the first two verses of Genesis handy? I can read it if we don't.
We can see it in your picture.
Yeah, oh yeah, you guys get it bigger too. Does anybody want to read it from there?
I'm happy to.
I don't know what translation it is, but anyway.
That's all right. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void.
Wait.
And darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters.
So what are I notice three distinct characteristics that Genesis brings up. And we have English, we have formless, we have void, and we have dark. Formless and void, and Jaden, you might appreciate this as a linguist. In Hebrew, it's tau bao hosek. Formless, void, and dark. Tau bao hosek. In the beginning, everything was dark. It was a dark, wasteful emptiness. God's creative act is a rescue operation of redeeming everything, literally everything you can imagine, from the forces of disorder. As a veteran, I read this verse not as God conquering chaos, so much as intervening in a melancholy cosmos. Melancholia is a Greek word that means black bile, which kind of captures the nature of things before God introduces light and form to creation. For centuries, melancholy has been used as a medical diagnosis for an array of ailments that we now associate with depression. After the Industrial Revolution applied the idol of efficiency to weapons of war, melancholy and nostalgia became the diagnosis of choice for soldiers and veterans seen as having become unfit for continued service. Other darker labels included slurs like malingerer or coward. And if you'll entertain me, I actually pulled the whole quote from the book from archive.gov. Nostalgia, and this is from the Manual of Instruction for Enlisting and Discharging Soldiers in 1864. Nostalgia is a form of mental disease which comes more frequently under the observation of the military surgeon. Nostalgia, and this is a quote from another work, when it is of long duration and resists the means of moral treatment and has produced a profound alteration of the organism, is a case for reform. And that's the end of the outside quote. Considered as a mental disease, and there can be no doubt that the primary phenomena of this state are mental, it belongs to the class melancholia. The extreme mental depression and the unconquerable longing for home soon produce a state of cachexy, loss of appetite, derangement of the assimilative functions, and finally, disease of the abdominal viscera. In fact, the objective phenomena of the typhoid state. Young men, it is said, are the most usual subjects of this disease, especially young men belonging to the races and people remarkable for their attachment to home and country. But in our Army, married men of middle life are more liable to it, particularly those given to solitary vice or victims of spermatorrhea, which was considered a seminal weakness, where you couldn't control a male cannot control their ejaculate. And a variety of drugs and other treatments, including circumcision and castration, were advised as treatment. So this is the etymological and medical heritage of post-traumatic stress disorder and other forms like battlefield fatigue, neurasthenia, shell shock. And so we must begin this study as the Bible begins, in darkness. It happens that darkness is also an appropriate starting point for talking about the state of the military, since its members continue to experience high rates of suicide compared to their civilian counterparts. According to the most recent data from the relevant federal departments, including the VA and DoD, a veteran will take their own life every 84 minutes, and a soldier will do the same every 15 hours. And you'll see on your screen a graph pulled from the 2021 National Suicide Report by the VA. If you read that, and I can provide the URL, they make a big case about that drop between 2017 and 2019. What they don't mention is the increase, the steady increase from 2001. I encourage you to read it. It's kind of frustrating if you're a vet because they go out of their way to make it sound like that little dip is something when I'm not sure it is. But anyway, the people who control policy and direct federal funding do not do so from military experience. Neither of the Congressional Veterans Affairs Committee chairs, John Tester and Mark Takano, have served. The VA Secretary, Dennis Richard McDonough, is also a civilian, and even with a federal hiring preference for veterans, less than a third of his 300,000 employees have served. Military families get treatment on par with other minorities. Outsiders, civilians, determine the flow of resources and direct the conversation. For the sake of comparison and to understand why I use this term minorities, we can combine the total force members and dependents with veterans and find that the military community represents just 8% of the total American population. By comparison, about 26% of Americans live with a disability, 13.4% indicate their race as Black or African American on the census, and 5.6% identify as LGBT, which is a number that has doubled, according to Gallup, since I've got this last statistic. The military, on the other hand, is decreasing in size almost as quickly. So this is not just a secular problem, as though Christian soldiers are in the clear. As far as anyone can tell, civilians wrote the entirety of the Gospels and epistles. A lack of experience does not stop the Apostle Saul from waxing nostalgic to the Christians of Ephesus about military equipment, but he is right to point out that the church does battle not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, authorities, and cosmic powers of this present darkness, against, and he names them, the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. These words were not a rallying cry as though Paul is calling Christians to battle. The struggle is defensive, to stand firm in verse 13 against the ancient black bile of old. If we want to understand soldiers and veterans, we have to go back to the basics, to the beginning, to the very nature of disorder. The present darkness oppressing military communities, I believe, is that primordial black bile melancholia. It's too easy to map Genesis onto our present darkness by diagnosing soldiers and veterans as a site of chaotic disorder. If PTSD is the problem, then drugs and therapy are the solution, and civilians are their saviors. Looking at Genesis, we see a story of universal disorder in which chaos is everything and everywhere. A biblical perspective begins with the assumption that whole societies are sites of disorder rather than minority groups. Military communities have been dropping the D from PTSD as either a rejection of military saviors or an affirmation of their own human dignity, or both. If this present darkness of ours is characterized by military suicide, it's not because God has failed to hear the cry of soldiers and veterans, but because civilian society has. So let's talk about the spiritual forces at work in oppression. According to Hilda Lindemann, Emerita Professor of Philosophy at Michigan State University, oppression takes two basic forms. Deprivation of opportunity is the name that she gives to the kind of oppression most are familiar with. It includes bias, harassment, discrimination directed at vulnerable groups. The second form is more insidious and unseen. Infiltration of consciousness is the name she gives to those same forces, but when they are internalized. And here are the direct quotes from her book. Deprivation of opportunity is when a powerful social group views the member of one's own less powerful group as unworthy of full moral respect, and in consequence, unjustly prevents that person from occupying valuable social roles or entering into desirable relationships. Infiltrated consciousness is when a person endorses as a portion of their own self-concept a dominant group's dismissive or exploitative understanding of that group, and in consequence loses or fails to acquire a sense of themselves as worthy of full moral respect. So, tis aimi aletheia. If anybody knows Greek, you might recognize this from Pilate's words after Jesus tells him that, or he says something about I am man, or Pilate says, what is truth? And in the Greek, you'll notice at the second part of that third word, it has the Greek word theia, or theos at its root. But aletheia means something more like unconcealed or sincere. You may be more familiar with its Latin, quid est veritas. And we read it often as Pilate saying, what is truth? But it's something more like what is known, or what can be known, what is unconcealed. According to prevailing wisdom, PTSD and military suicide represent a mental health crisis. We can tell that's the case because the go-to treatments are drugs and therapy. We don't hear the perspective of soldiers and veterans as much as we should. They're stigmatized from within for seeking help, and they're outnumbered if they object to prevailing civilian wisdom. I have a theory, and this is just a theory, but it is one that I find compelling and have difficulty disproving. I think that we have not seen something like a military coup or Chemo Lives Matter because the voices that otherwise would make up such a movement are silenced before anything takes shape. Not necessarily by civilian resistance, but because they silence themselves. What would those 17 veterans and one soldier every day, what would they say? What have they said? Do we know what they've said? We might not be able to know, but we can try and see the world through their lens. And that is what this Bible study is ultimately about. So to outline where we'll be going from here, this is the path I've laid out for us. And I also have this on the Eventbrite page. Each session I will challenge you to think more deeply about what you think you know about Jesus and his scriptural and historical context. It's my belief that by uncovering or unconcealing the dimness of the mirror through which we see Christ, that truth of soldiers in scripture in our own world will be illuminated. I hope to take us both, civilian and soldier alike, from darkness to light.